The Hayes Advantage with Kathleen Hayes.
Peter D. Kiernan is a former senior partner at Goldman Sachs. He's chairman of his own venture firm and founding board member of the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation. His latest book is called Becoming China's Bitch and 9 More Catastrophes We Must Avoid Right Now, a manifesto for the radical center. Peter, welcome.
I'm delighted to be here.
And I want to start there because in some sense, to me, that's the title of the book that is so telling, the manifesto for the radical center. You laid out so many convincing arguments about the polarization in this country, but let's start with that concept. What do you mean by radical center?
What I mean is that ideology never really solved a problem. That common sense and hard work is what solves problems. And I've seen time after time where we get polarized, frozen, playing a chess game to stalemate. What we're trying to do is solve some major initiative, and we get sidetracked onto something like a debt ceiling conversation. That becomes the debate. And it hijacks all reason and hijacks all focus on the real issue.
Well, I think that one of the things very compelling about the first section of the book is you talk about polarization. And I've been doing radio for a while. I've done television before that. And I must confess that the history lesson we got on radio and the rise of the talk show hosts and who they are is such a fascinating part of the book. Tell us about that part, how that trend, why this has contributed to polarization in our country.
Well, radio is actually a great place to start because it's ever since the 30s, it's been a bully pulpit. And over time, as we saw television broadcasting evolve into 3 major networks, news at that point was delivered as if it was from the Temple Mount. It was objective, unbiased, and in fact, some cases, almost no personality injected into the deliverable. Then out in the provinces, radio was sort of gurgling. People who didn't know about each other were beginning to take more strong opinions to the right and to the left. And at first, it began with a former top 10 disc jockey who was brought out to California to replace someone who had failed in a talk show effort. And his name at the time was Chris Christie. Different. He changed his name back to his real name when he decided to go all talk, and that was Rush Limbaugh. Rush was really the first who started to say, let's take what's going on out there and interpret it. Let's see if we can build an audience based on people who feel the same way about developments as I do. And as it turned out, that led to a kind of a convolution. A number of things came together because not long after that, cable came on the scene, and cable was providing lots of choices that never existed before. And what cable was thirsty for was content. They needed something. They built a pipe. They needed something to run down it.
Will you dare the reader to join in the provocation? What exactly do you mean?
What I mean by that is, excuse me, once upon a time, it was easy to be moderate. Tip O'Neill once said, moderates, they're always around when you don't need them. And we don't need them now. In order to fight the architecture of divide that's been created, this is a multi-billion-dollar architecture that drives us from side to side. It is a matter of bravery and radical step to go into the center and say, I'm not going to buy into the ideology exclusively of the Republican Party or exclusively the Democratic Party. I'm going to do what makes sense. And actually, every time we see somebody leave their party to take that common sense solution, retribution is swift. And what I'm asking for people to do is, when your legislator takes a strong stand, maybe contrary to their own party, don't be an invertebrate. Stand with them. Be brave. Be radical. It's going to take a lot of initiative for the American people to break this logjam that's been created in Washington.
Now, are you actually calling for a third party, a third set of candidates, a third way? And I mean, we've had a couple of those in past elections, but are you calling for something a little bit more, tangible in that regard?
Let me answer that. It's a great question, and let me answer it in the business context, if I may, because it's sort of where I come from. But the hardest thing to break in any business context is a duopoly. So if it's Coke and Pepsi as an example, they spend a lot of time fighting each other, but they also do a very effective job of keeping any third player from coming into the fore. So there's almost nothing you can do from an entrenched, powerful duopoly to break in. It's very hard to do. Sometimes new technology or a whole new wave will do it. What's been interesting to me to see as a way of breaking down these dominant cultures in the Republican and Democratic parties is if you take a look at the Tea Party, for example, that's really a splinter group. What I like about the Tea Party is not necessarily what they stand for. In fact, I might find I disagree with much of what they stand for. But what I love about the Tea Party is that for most of the people in it, person after person and poll after poll, this is their first political experience of their lives. They've never given or supported a candidate before. They've never joined anything that feels like a movement before. Having that true grassroots initiative bubble up inside the Republican Party, I think, is an extremely healthy way to show how you can fragment what is an inert and unchanging duopoly. So I think that's a much more effective way to make change than to come up with a third party. There are some new technologies that I think are enabling things like Americans Elect, which has something like 800,000 members now, and that's an online political party. And if they can get to where I think they're going to go, we're going to hear a lot about Americans Elect because anybody can be a member.
You better sit down and have a strong stomach to read the chapter about lobbyists. Not that there aren't a lot of lobbyists in Washington who are doing good work, but the influence, the money, this has become a big theme. But when you just go through everything you say in this chapter, Peter, look at the experiences, look at the fact and the figures, it is really appalling in some ways.
Well, I think the best way to think about where lobbying has evolved is people tend to think in their mind is a heavyset guy who's whining and dining and lining a pocket with a legislator. And nothing could be further from the truth today. That these are 15,000 strong and growing, highly sophisticated, talented people. And we've outsourced elements of governing our nation to these lobbyists, to the point where it's not clear to me that we could possibly function without them. They are integrally involved. There are things called ITACs, committees all throughout the federal government, and lobbyists play a very major role, including chairing some of these.
The ITACs.
ITAC.
Tell our listeners what that is, please.
It is a committee inside the federal government that is set up to basically make the rules and regulations and to promote some of the laws that we live by. They are not necessary. A lot of people think that lobbyists spend all their time only with the legislative branch, and that's not the case. That they're very, very involved with how we run the business of government. And that's where these ITACs show up. And I think there are about 6,000 of them, but no one's ever made really a census of them. What's interesting is that these ITACs often have people who are lobbyists who are either chairing them or writing, keeping the minutes, or writing the actual regulations together. They're kind of the permanent side of government. If you think of government as a revolving door, there are a lot of these lobbyists who stay there permanently as a fixture, and they help grease the machinery of the federal government.
You have a chapter on think tanks as well, which comes after the lobbying chapter, and you make the point that they're also obviously mostly very partisan and come down on one side or the other and help the lobbyists, and that's also part of it. But isn't domestic politics, and hasn't it always been in the US, very fractious? There's two sides, they have advisors, that's pretty normal, and things, get done, there's checks and balances. Why is now different? Why do we need something else now?
Well, I think your point is completely valid that we've always been fractious. We know how to do divide. We know how to resolve problems. What's happened now is that we have created this infrastructure. For example, you mentioned the think tanks. There are think tanks now with bigger endowments than some colleges. These are big, established organizations with incredibly talented folks. The Council on Foreign Relations has every living Secretary of State, and it has an extraordinary roster of super talented, very, very influential, very, very thoughtful people. If you think of policy formulation as a cycle, something that kind of goes through various stages, what's changed now is that think tanks have gotten very effective, Heritage and some of these others, at being at the right place, in the right room, at the right time to help guide and govern that policy formulation. It can show up in funny ways. When you hear a new aspirant to a political office hold forth with great vigor and insight on some particulate in the foreign policy dialogue, the chances are very good that that person has been trained. And this has all been explained to them in great detail by a think tank. Think tanks are sort of interesting because they operate on two sides of the equation. They're kind of private. They don't say much about themselves, yet they're cited thousands and thousands of times in the public press. So they kind of play both ends of the side. They're very marketing-oriented now, and in the marketplace of ideas, think tanks are the brokers.
In a way, you're sort of arguing for a whole different type of legislative way of governing in the United States. Is there a country around the world that you think it should be more modelled after then?
I'm not sure I have a Nirvana or a Kubla Khan, an Xanadu to point to. What I do think we need to do is to think carefully about the access that we're allowing these lobbyists and think tanks to have, because it's really a case of selectorate. I think
selectorate, that's one of my favorite words from your book.
Well, it's sort of a made-up word, and I apologize to all the linguists, but what I was trying to do is say that we're used to, when we're in school, that there's an electorate that decides things. I think there's another layer. There's kind of a frozen tundra layer above it of selectorate, of people who are in the room when we aren't, and they have huge impact. In the UK, they have a shadow government because a government can always be toppled, and so there are a lot of people in waiting. I think the think tanks and to a lesser extent the lobbyists are the closest thing we have to a shadow government. We have to organize it much differently. You know, the revolving door of people who leave from either staffs of senators or people who have been legislators or senators who go immediately or more or less immediately into positions of influence with these lobbies and think tanks, I think that's a cautionary tale, and it's something we got to watch much more carefully than we do.
Having come from Wall Street and still being involved in investing and such, do you share the view that when it comes to, say, the banking industry and banking legislation and reform or lack of reform, that the money and the lobbyists play an undue influence here as well?
Well, they certainly play a major influence. Listen, I think anybody who would look back at the history, and I'm a card-carrying member of that discredited class of Wall Street folks, so I'll admit it. You know, the freedom of action is what was so powerful. We were allowed to go places where there were no real regulations, and that's where the trouble begins.
Peter, we've talked about the extreme political polarization. So now we're going to talk about some of the dangerous paths we're on that need the opposite of polarization. We need unification. We need determination. We need pragmatic solutions. Let's start with China. What's wrong? What must we avoid?
Well, I think as a general matter, anytime you're asked to govern yourself or something in uncertain times, you make a list of 30 issues that you want to worry about, and you prioritize 10. So I chose 10. Saying these, someone else's 10 might be different, but these are ones that I think vex us. I think chief among them is our relationship with China. If you think back, at least to my youth, we had the finest minds in our nation. We had George F. Kennan, we had Kissinger, we had Brzezinski, watching every twist and turn of the Soviet Union, watching them strategically, tactically, everything they're doing. Who's watching China, which represents a much bigger opportunity and perhaps at least economically a much bigger threat? Who's watching China for us today? Who are the real thought leaders on China in our government? You know, I'm hoping that we can have Barack Obama be the last president we elect where we have no clue where the individual stands on China. China is a very, very powerful counterparty. We're in a codependency with them. They can call it an exports for finance codependency. We like their cheap goods, and they stock a lot of our retail shelves, and we tend to go to them to borrow whenever we need to. And since 42% of our budget is borrowed, they are, as a result, the second largest holder of dollar assets outside of the USA. And therefore, we are in this strange kind of codependency where we have a $300 billion balance of trade with this one country, and they provide a very, very large source of borrowing to us. And so your banker is also your supplier. That's not a wise long-term business strategy. And I think we have to think about that.
What about this trade enforcement unit that the president has announced?
I think that's a good start. You know, he signaled something like this was coming in the State of the Union not too long ago, and I think going after what is clearly unfair, unlevel playing fields and unfair advantage, this is a currency that has been kept weak for a long time. And if you kind of pan back the lens, in 1 or 2 days in 1994, they devalued the currency there by almost 50%. Now, since that day, the U.S. has lost about 6 million manufacturing jobs, and China has created about 10 million manufacturing jobs. Now, some of those jobs, despite what the candidates are saying, have left our shores and are never coming back. We've exported them. But the notion that we would have a relationship with China where we are such a codependent partner, where we wouldn't have deep conversations when we felt the playing field wasn't level, or we thought they were taking advantage in terms of trade, that's unthinkable in terms of a thoughtful, intelligent relationship.
Well, in your opinion, does the US need to be the biggest economy? And why does the US need to be the biggest economy?
You know, I'm not sure at this stage they can be the biggest economy because of some of the choices we've made or choices we haven't made.
But does that matter? Isn't it the quality of the economy that matters?
Well, it does. And if you're running massive trillion-dollar plus deficits, then you're running an economy that basically can't sustain itself. And that's, it's an excellent point. I think that the next century is going to be one where we cede our position to China and they gain against us. And the only thing we're debating is where those lines cross.
Peter, I want to ask you about China, more some domestic or international politics right now around oil and what's going on with Iran. I know that you have some specific thoughts about how China really stands on this and how it could affect this whole question of what's going on, which is one of the reasons, of course, we've had crude up over 109, actually briefly touching 110 barrels on dollars a barrel on West Texas.
Well, it goes directly back to the question, too, of what kind of economy do we want to have. The dilemma with China on energy is this, that they have developed a taste for oil that's as powerful or soon to be more powerful than our own. They are already the number one user of coal in the world, and some Wall Street houses are predicting they'll be the number one user of oil in the world. Right now, we use about 25% of the world's oil. So that if you asked me where do I think the first intersection of trouble economically is going to be with China, it's going to be over oil. Now, you mentioned Iran, and Iran's a perfect case in point because I've heard some very sophisticated people say that the Iran situation is like the Cuban Missile Crisis in slow motion. But it's got one premier difference, one principal difference, and that is we're trying to do kind of a blockade, an embargo. We're trying to economically surround Iran and punish them and slow them down so that they'll, in fact, relent on their nuclear expansion activities. The trouble is that China buys about 20%. In fact, there are 4 countries that buy 50% of Iranian oil: China, India, Japan, and Turkey. Now, Turkey gets 40% of its oil from China, so it's not going to be cutting back. China's indicated they might cut back 10%, and China and India are probably in that 10% category too, but they're not doing it for accommodation to our wishes. They're doing it because, well, in China's case, they're using it to renegotiate their prices to get cheaper prices out of Iran. Now, there's kind of a funny dividend that's coming Iran's way because even though we're reducing the amount of oil that's going because the EU has stepped aside, China is kind of keeping them afloat and working, frankly, cross purposes to us.
Now, when you, I want to jump around here because we have so much time. 10 catastrophes we have to avoid, but certainly, again, it's in the news now. It's on a lot of people's minds. Energy policy. Do we, people say, some people say we don't have one. We don't have a coherent one. I'm sure President Obama were here, he'd say, well, I've been trying to get my vision of energy through. There's the controversy over the XL pipeline that has not been okayed. Again, what is the catastrophe that faces us in this polarized political world? What must we do to avoid it?
I'll give you that's a fabulous question. And one of the things that Obama and, frankly, presidents before have said, it's an all of the above solution. And he's actually used that phrase, all the above. And all the above is one of those, it's a tough thing because it's dangerous because it's a bad idea that's disguised as a good idea. It sounds reasonable because we know we're going to have to do a lot of different things. But we're going to have to get much tougher about making choices and priorities in the world of energy. And that's how you can sort of talk yourself out of the Keystone Pipeline. I'll give you an example. We just approved for the first time since 3 Mile Island, so almost 30 years ago, the first nuclear power plants in the country. It's going to cost $14 billion and take 5 years. Now, I'm willing to bet, not Mitt Romney, but I'm willing to bet some people that it'll take longer than 5 years and cost more than $14 billion. But why don't we pan the lens back for a second and look at our nuclear strategy? We have about 104 nuclear plants running in this country, and let's suppose they weren't all brand new 30 years ago when we decided we're not going to build anymore. And let's just take a shot and say the average age is 45 years of those plants. Are we running them full tilt? Yes, we are. Who is the biggest producer? You hear a lot of noise about France and how much nuclear energy. We have double the capacity almost of France. Now, they use 75%. They use nuclear energy for 75%, but our 20% that we use for nuclear is much, much bigger than France's 75%. So we are the world leader in producing.
So far, unless China takes us over, because they're going full tilt, aren't they?
They are going full tilt. But here's the thing that I worry about. In about 5 to 7 years, we'll have our first 2 new reactors coming on stream. At that point, the remaining 104 will be, you call it, 50 to 60 years old. If it takes 10 years to build new ones, that means before we can be on stream, we have 70-year-old plant that we're running full tilt. This is not one of those situations where people say when it's 100 degrees out and you want your air conditioning, let's take it easy on the old nuclear power plant. Let's run that old fellow a little bit slower. We have a strategy that's backing us into a real problem. Either we're going to have a massive due bill in terms of build-out, or worse, you don't have to be in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to know that if you're running 70-year-old or 60-year-old equipment full tilt, you're taking risks. And this is a strategy by default. We have a nuclear strategy, which is a do nothing, stay the course, hope nothing happens strategy. And that's the kind of thing we have to change.
I can't tell, are you for or against nuclear energy?
Oh, I'm absolutely. We as a nation are deeply, deeply dependent on nuclear energy. And anybody who says we can get rid of nuclear energy, there's no replacement.
Well, our time is running out, Peter, but I wanted to ask you about one of the other 10 catastrophes, I guess, one of the other 9 more, apart from the China catastrophe, and that's the devolution of the labour movement. You argue that unions need to be stronger, and I wanted to get your thoughts on Occupy Wall Street as well.
Well, let me try. Labour unions, the interesting thing there is it's done a complete flip-flop. When I was a boy, 35% of the people who worked in corporations and companies were unionized, and about 7% of people who worked in public service were unionized. Now it's vice versa. About 7% of people who work in corporations are unionized, and there have been an unbelievable surge. 36 or 37% of the people who work in public service for the government are unionized. And the difference, of course, is that in this case, you elect your boss. I think one of the things we have to figure out is how you work in a circumstance where unions have basically allowed these well-intentioned entitlements to grow and grow and grow, and we can't afford them. As it relates to Occupy Wall Street, I don't think they're finished. I think there's more to come, and we've only begun to hear from them.
Well, Peter D. Kiernan, we'll look forward to having you back. A great look at your book today, Becoming China's Bitch and 9 More Catastrophes We Must Avoid Right Now, a manifesto for the Radical Center. Thank
you so much for having me.
You can listen to The Hayes Advantage weekdays at noon Eastern on Bloomberg 1130 in New York or on Sirius and XM Satellite Radio Channel 113. Copyright 2012 Bloomberg LP.